The crimson sky of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the settlement as James tinkered with the salvaged medical equipment in his makeshift lab. The colony ship Horizon had crashed 3 months ago, leaving him as the only trained physician for 50 colonists scattered across the outpost. His hands moved carefully over the broken machinery, trying to fix what little he could with the limited resources available on this strange, rust-colored world. James was so focused on his work that he almost did not hear the sound at first. It came from far away, a deep cry that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath his feet. He stopped what he was doing and listened carefully. The sound grew louder, more desperate, like nothing he had ever heard before in his entire life. It was not human. It was not anything from Earth. James rushed outside into the fading light, his heart pounding in his chest. The other colonists were already emerging from their shelters, pointing and shouting. At first, James could not see what they were looking at. Then he saw it. There, at the edge of the settlement's perimeter, stood a creature of impossible beauty and terror. Her scales shimmered like molten bronze under the strange alien sun. Her wings, though tattered and bleeding, stretched out across the rust-colored soil like broken silk. The creature was enormous, at least 4 stories tall, with claws as long as James's forearm. She was a dragon, though James had never believed dragons were real until this very moment. The dragon dropped to her front limbs, and James saw that she was carrying something in her talons. At first he thought it was prey. Then he realized it was something else. It was a young dragon, small and still, cradled carefully in the mother's arms like a precious jewel. The mother dragon made a sound that was unlike anything James had ever heard. It was like breaking glass mixed with a child's sob, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest part of her being. Her enormous eyes, golden and ancient, fixed on James with an intensity that transcended the barrier between species. In those eyes, James saw something he recognized instantly. It was desperation. It was fear. It was the plea of a mother whose child was dying. "Don't move," whispered Elizabeth, the colony's weapons officer, stepping beside him with a rifle raised. She was shaking, her finger hovering near the trigger. "James, we don't know what this thing is. It could be dangerous." But James saw something in those eyes that made him ignore the warning. He saw past the scales and the claws and the impossible size. He saw a mother, just like any mother on Earth, terrified for her child's life. "Lower your weapon," he said quietly, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "James, that's insane," Elizabeth said. "You're going to get yourself killed." James did not listen. He walked toward the dragon, each step feeling eternal. His mind raced with fear, but his feet kept moving forward. The creature was easily 4 stories tall, her claws as long as his forearm, her teeth visible when she opened her mouth. She could kill him with a single swipe. She could crush him like an insect beneath her talons. But she did not move. As James drew closer, he could see the young dragon more clearly. Its scales were dull and cracked like porcelain, lacking the beautiful bronze shimmer of its mother. Dark veins spread beneath its skin like cracks in broken glass. The small dragon's breathing was shallow and labored, each breath seeming to cost it tremendous effort. James recognized the signs immediately. The synthetic spores. They had been plaguing the planet for months, poisoning the water and the air, making the colonists sick. James had been studying them, trying to find a cure. But he had never imagined they would affect the native creatures this way. He had never imagined they would come to him for help. The mother dragon watched James approach, her massive head lowering. She made the breaking glass sound again, softer this time, almost like a question. Then, slowly and carefully, she extended one talon toward James. There, cradled in her claw, was the dying young dragon. James looked at the poisoned creature, then back at the mother's desperate eyes. He thought about his own mother, dead now for many years, thought about how she had loved him, how she would have done anything to save his life. He thought about how love was the same everywhere in the universe, how a mother's heart was a mother's heart, no matter what shape it took. "I can try," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can help, but I can try. I promise you I will do everything I can." The mother dragon made a sound, and it took James a moment to realize it was a sound of agreement. She carefully, so very carefully, lowered her talon and released the young dragon into his arms. The small creature was heavier than James expected, and he struggled to hold it securely. But he did not drop it. He would not drop it. Elizabeth lowered her rifle, her mouth open in shock. "James, what are you doing?" "Taking her to the lab," James said, already moving. "Tell Governor Patricia we have a patient. Tell her we're going to need every resource we have. Tell her we're going to try to save a life." As James carried the poison dragon back toward his makeshift medical facility, the mother followed behind him, her enormous shadow falling across the settlement. The colonists watched in stunned silence as a human and a dragon walked together into the lab, crossing a bridge that no one had ever imagined could be built. Behind them, Kepler 442b's crimson sun sank lower on the horizon, and everything began to change. James carried the young dragon into his makeshift lab, her weight pressing down on his arms. The small creature's breathing was shallow and weak, barely noticeable. Her scales felt cold to the touch, like ice, which was not a good sign. The mother dragon followed close behind, squeezing her massive body through the entrance of the lab. She was so large that her head nearly touched the ceiling, and her tail knocked over several bottles of medical supplies as she maneuvered herself inside. Elizabeth rushed in behind them, her rifle still in her hands but lowered now. She stared at the scene before her in disbelief. The mother dragon positioned herself at the entrance, her enormous body blocking out most of the light from outside. She lay down carefully, her golden eyes never leaving her daughter. Her breathing synchronized perfectly with the young dragon's shallow gasps, as if she was trying to breathe for both of them through sheer force of will. "James, this is impossible," said Dr. Robert, the colony's botanist, rushing over with a medical scanner. He had been working in the adjacent room when he heard the commotion. His face went pale when he saw the dragons. "What are we even looking at here? I have never seen anything like this in any database." James was already moving, his medical training taking over despite his racing mind. He gently placed the young dragon on a clean examination table, which sagged under the creature's weight but held firm. "Start scanning," he told Robert. "I need to understand her physiology." Robert activated the portable medical scanner, passing it slowly over the young dragon's body. The device beeped and buzzed, collecting data that should have been impossible. On the small screen they could see something extraordinary. Throughout the dragon's body were formations that looked like crystals, delicate and intricate, woven through her muscles and bones like a second skeleton made of glass and gemstones. "These crystalline structures," Robert whispered, his voice shaking. "They are not defects. They are part of her natural biology. Look at how they are integrated into her entire system." James leaned closer, studying the scan. He could see the dark veins spreading through her body, exactly like the synthetic spores he had been studying. But instead of attacking her normal cells, the poison was crystallizing these strange structures, turning them into something rigid and sharp. It was like watching glass slowly harden inside a living being. "The poison is crystallizing her internal structures," James said, his mind already racing through possibilities. "If we cannot stop this, those crystals will grow until they pierce her vital organs. She will not survive more than a few hours." The mother dragon made a soft sound, a quiet moan of suffering. She pressed her head closer to her daughter, her enormous eyes filled with a pain that transcended species. James felt the weight of her desperation. He could not fail. He would not fail. But traditional medicine would not work here. Antibiotics would be useless. Surgery was too risky. One wrong cut could rupture those delicate crystal formations and kill her instantly. "We need a different approach," James said, pacing back and forth. "We cannot fight this poison with conventional weapons." He spent the next hour downloading every medical journal, every scientific paper, every piece of information stored in the colony's limited database. He cross-referenced human pain management techniques, harmonic frequencies, crystalline structure data. His fingers flew across the keyboard as ideas began to form in his mind. What if they could use sound? What if they could find a specific frequency that would resonate with the dragon's crystalline biology? "Robert, I need you to help me build something," James said. "I need speakers. I need equipment that can produce very specific sound frequencies. Can you do that?" Robert stared at him. "James, are you talking about using sound waves to treat a poison dragon? That is insane." "Yes," James agreed. "It is completely insane. But it might work. It might be the only thing that will work." They worked frantically, salvaging equipment from the crashed ship. James calibrated speakers to emit precise frequencies based on the crystalline formations he saw in the scans. Robert gathered medications derived from Kepler 442b's indigenous plants that Elizabeth had collected weeks earlier. They mixed compounds, tested theories, and made educated guesses based on incomplete information. 18 hours passed. James did not sleep. He did not eat. He worked continuously, monitoring the young dragon's vital signs obsessively. With every passing hour, the dark veins spread a little further through her body. The crystals grew a little sharper. Kaildar, the mother dragon, never left her daughter's side. She could have easily destroyed the lab with a single swipe of her tail. She could have taken her daughter and fled. But instead, she held perfectly still, her enormous body rigid with tension, her eyes tracking James's every movement. And somehow, in that stillness there was trust. Complete and absolute trust. On the 23rd hour, James activated the speakers for the first time. The sound was almost below human hearing, a vibration that seemed to come from the very foundation of the earth. The young dragon's crystalline structures began to glow faintly, responding to the frequencies. "It is working," whispered Robert, watching the scan. "Look at the poison. It is starting to separate." The dark veins began to recede like spilled ink being drawn backward by an invisible hand. The crystals that had been hardening and growing now began to soften, to break apart. 1 hour passed. 2 hours. 3 hours. On the 24th hour, the young dragon's eyes fluttered open. They were clear and golden, filled with awareness. Her breathing deepened, becoming strong and steady. Her scales began to shimmer with that beautiful bronze luster. James collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down his face. He had done it. Against all odds, using knowledge from Earth combined with science they did not fully understand, he had saved her life. Kaeldar made that breaking glass sound again, but this time it was different. This time it was a song. Velkara, the young dragon, recovered with remarkable speed over the following days. Her body seemed to understand what James had done for her, and she rewarded his efforts by healing faster than any human patient could have. By the end of the first week, she was standing on her own 4 legs, though she moved slowly and carefully. By the second week, she was walking around the lab, her tail swishing behind her with newfound strength. By the third week, she was playing. James watched as Velkara chased a ball that Elizabeth had fashioned from spare fabric and stuffing. The young dragon pounced on it, picked it up in her mouth, shook it like a toy, and released it to chase again. Her mother, Kaeldar, watched from the corner of the lab, and James could have sworn the massive dragon was smiling. But something more important began to happen during those weeks of recovery. Kaeldar started to communicate. Every morning she would appear at the settlement's edge, waiting for James. He would come out and she would make sounds. At first they seemed random, just the roars and rumbles of a wild creature. But James began to notice patterns. The sounds had rhythm. They had meaning. There was a structure to them, almost like a language, though nothing like any human language he had ever heard. James started keeping records. He wrote down every sound Kaeldar made, describing the pitch, the duration, the context. He spent hours listening to the recordings, playing them back, studying them. Elizabeth thought he had gone mad. Robert suggested he was spending too much time without sleep. But James knew he was on the edge of something profound. One morning, about 4 weeks after Velkara's recovery, James had a breakthrough. He was reviewing his recordings when he noticed something. The sounds were not just random. They were building on each other, creating patterns that repeated. It was like watching someone spell out words in a foreign language. "She is not just making noise," James said to Robert, who had come to check on him. "She is trying to communicate. The dragons have a language. A real language." "That is impossible," Robert said. "Dragons are not intelligent enough to develop language." "Are they not?" James asked. "Kaeldar saved her own daughter's life by finding me. She trusted a human with her child. She understood that I could help. That is intelligence. That is reason. That is exactly what you would expect from an intelligent species." Over the next few days, James began to decode the dragon's communication. It was slow and difficult work, filled with false starts and dead ends. But gradually, patterns emerged. Certain sounds meant certain things. When Kaeldar made a low rumbling sound followed by a high-pitched trill, it seemed to mean something about danger. When she made a series of clicking sounds, it seemed related to her daughter. Then one day James made a discovery that changed everything. Kaeldar had been making her usual sounds when suddenly she closed her eyes. Her entire body went rigid. James felt a strange sensation in his mind, like someone was trying to speak directly into his thoughts. Images began to flash through his consciousness. He saw ancient dragons, thousands of them, living in magnificent cities built from crystal and stone. He saw them working together, building wonders that defied understanding. He saw knowledge flowing between them like rivers of light. Then he saw darkness. He saw something terrible happen, an event so catastrophic that it scattered the dragons across the world, forcing them into hiding, making them solitary creatures struggling for survival. James gasped and opened his eyes. Kaeldar was watching him, her golden eyes filled with something like hope. "You showed me," James whispered. "You showed me memories. Or impressions. I do not fully understand what I just experienced." Over the following weeks, through a combination of sound patterns and these strange mental impressions, James began to piece together the dragon's history. Kaeldar revealed coordinates to dragon sanctuaries hidden deep within Kepler 442b's crystal caverns. She shared knowledge about the planet's ecosystem, information that had been lost to humanity. She explained how the synthetic spores had been introduced centuries ago by a colonial expedition that had come to the planet and then vanished. Without the dragons to keep the spores in check, they had spread unchecked across the world. But most importantly, Kaeldar offered something that James had never expected. She offered technology. Ancient knowledge carved into crystal formations. Mathematical formulas that the Draconis civilization had developed before their fall. The dragons possessed wisdom that was older than human civilization itself. "Why are you telling me this?" James asked one evening, sitting beside Kaeldar as the sun set over the rust-colored desert. "Why trust a human with this knowledge?" Kaeldar made a series of sounds and James understood. She was saying that humanity was different from other species the dragons had encountered over the centuries. Humans possessed something rare. They had compassion. They had the ability to help a stranger, to risk their own lives for someone else's child. They had seen a mother in desperate need and had chosen to help instead of choosing to fear or to exploit. "She wants to form an alliance," James told Governor Patricia and the Colony Council later that day. "She believes that humans and dragons could work together. She believes we could help each other." Governor Patricia leaned forward. "Can we trust her?" James thought about the past weeks. He thought about a dying young dragon now running and playing. He thought about a mother's desperation turned into a mother's gratitude. He thought about the knowledge and wisdom that Kaeldar had shared with him. "Yes," James said firmly. "We can trust her. Because she trusted us first. And that trust has already changed everything." Velkera bounded into the council chamber, her scales glowing that beautiful bronze, and released a plume of harmonic fire into the air. It was a sound of joy, of hope, of a future that no one had imagined possible. The news traveled across the vast distances of space at the speed of light. James's reports, sent through the colony's communication array, reached the Terran Federation headquarters 3 months later. The messages described everything: the crashed ship, the poisoned dragon, the impossible cure, and the alliance that had formed between two species that should never have met. The response from Earth was overwhelming. Within weeks, a massive research vessel called the Discovery arrived in orbit above Kepler 442b. It carried scientists, doctors, engineers, and military personnel. But most importantly, it carried hope. Dr. Eleanor stepped off the shuttle first. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She had spent her entire career studying alien biology, but she had never imagined she would work with a living, breathing dragon. Behind her came Professor David, a young man with brilliant ideas about ancient alien technology. Together, they represented humanity's best minds, sent to learn from the dragons. James brought them to meet Kaeldar immediately. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Eleanor said, walking around the massive dragon carefully, studying every scale and claw. "The crystalline formations in her body, they are not just structural. They are integrated into her nervous system. She could be using them to process information in ways we have never imagined." Kaeldar made her communication sounds and James translated as best he could. The dragon was explaining her species' biology, how the crystals allowed them to sense vibrations in the earth, how they used them to communicate across vast distances, how they had once used them to power their entire civilization. "She is saying that humans and dragons could combine their knowledge," James said. "She believes that human medical science combined with dragon understanding of this planet could create something neither species could achieve alone." Dr. Eleanor and Professor David exchanged glances. Without hesitation they agreed. The collaboration that followed was the most intensive scientific effort the colony had ever undertaken. Dr. Eleanor worked with Kaeldar to study the synthetic spores at a cellular level. The dragon explained how the native plants on Kepler 442b had evolved to resist the spores. She showed them root systems and leaf structures that had natural antibacterial properties. Dr. Eleanor took this knowledge and combined it with human pharmaceutical science, creating new compounds that could neutralize the poison. Professor David, meanwhile, studied the ancient dragon technology with Velkera, who had become his eager student. The young dragon showed him crystal formations that had been buried deep underground for centuries. These crystals contained geometric patterns and mathematical formulas that represented advanced knowledge about energy manipulation and structural engineering. David realized that the dragons had developed a form of technology that was not based on electricity and mechanics like human technology, but on harmony, vibration, and natural forces. They were not primitive at all. David told James one evening. They were advanced in completely different ways. While humans were building machines, dragons were learning to work with the planet itself. Within 3 months, the first breakthrough came. Dr. Eleanor and her team, working with samples provided by Kaeldar, had developed a biological agent that neutralized the synthetic spores without harming the planet's ecosystem. They tested it carefully, making sure it was safe, and then released it into the water systems. The results were miraculous. The spores began to die. The poisoned areas of the land began to recover. The sick colonists started to heal. But the real transformation came when other dragon pods began to emerge from their hidden sanctuaries. Word had spread through the dragon population, passed through their vibration-based communication system, that there was a human who had saved a dragon child, that there were scientists willing to learn from dragons rather than exploit them, that an alliance was possible. Slowly, carefully, dragons began to leave their caves and shelters. Some were wary. Some were damaged by years of hiding and fear. But they came. And as they came, the settlement transformed. Human workers and dragons worked side by side in research facilities, studying the planet together. Human farmers and dragons cultivated crops using dragon knowledge of the soil and plant life. Human engineers and dragons designed buildings that used crystal formations for power and communication. The colony grew rapidly, its population tripling as new human colonists arrived from the Federation, drawn by the opportunity to work on this unprecedented project. Governor Patricia established new laws. Dragons had rights. They could own land. They could participate in government decisions. They were not creatures to be studied or controlled, but partners and citizens. But the real test of the alliance came 6 months into the collaboration. One night, seismic sensors detected something moving deep beneath the ocean. Something large. Something aggressive. Within hours, creatures began to emerge from the depths. They were ancient organisms made of chitin and armor, with too many legs and too many teeth. They were unlike anything the scientists had catalogued. And they were hungry. They attacked the settlement at dawn, moving faster than anyone had anticipated. The creatures were enormous, some of them the size of buildings, and they seemed intelligent, coordinated, purposeful. The synthetic spores suddenly seemed like a minor inconvenience compared to this threat. "We cannot fight them alone," James told the council as alarms blared throughout the settlement. "We will not fight alone," Kaeldar said through James's translation. "We fight together." Velkara took to the sky with human pilots in combat suits, her bronze scales flashing in the light as she unleashed waves of harmonic fire. The pilots used advanced weapons while the dragon used her natural abilities, and together they formed a force that was unstoppable. James found himself not in a lab but on the front lines, carrying weapons, using his medical knowledge to keep soldiers alive even as they fought beside dragons. The battle lasted 3 days. By the end, the creatures had been driven back into the depths from which they came. Humans and dragons stood together, exhausted but victorious, having faced an enemy that threatened both their species. As the dust settled and the survivors regrouped, everyone understood something fundamental. They were no longer two separate species trying to cooperate. They were one civilization, bound together by sacrifice and shared purpose. 5 years had passed since that first desperate night when Kaeldar brought her dying daughter to James. The settlement had transformed beyond recognition. Where there had once been makeshift shelters and salvaged equipment, now stood magnificent structures built from crystal and stone, designed by both human and dragon architects working in perfect harmony. James stood in the newly constructed Hall of Understanding, watching representatives from 7 different alien species tour the facility. News of the Human-Dragon Alliance had spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Every civilization wanted to understand how 2 species so different had learned not just to coexist, but to thrive together. A Zephyrian diplomat, a tall being made of light and sound, whispered to his translator. The translator converted his words into human language so James could understand. "We have warred with the Draconis for 3,000 years, the diplomat said. "How did humanity accomplish what we could not?" James smiled. "We did not try to defeat them," he said simply. "We tried to help them." Governor Patricia stood at the podium, addressing the assembled delegates from across the known galaxy. 5 years ago, one man made a choice, she said, gesturing to James. He saw a mother in desperation and chose compassion over fear. He saw a dying child and chose hope over resignation. That single choice has changed the trajectory of our entire civilization. James listened to her words, but he was thinking about something else. He was thinking about the moment when he first walked toward that enormous dragon, when every rational part of his mind had screamed at him to turn back, to hide, to let someone else make the decision. He was thinking about how one small choice, made in a moment of uncertainty, could ripple outward to touch entire worlds. The tour continued through the Hall of Understanding. The visitors saw walls covered with scientific achievements. They saw the formula for the biological agent that had saved both human and dragon lives from the synthetic spores. They saw crystal formations carved with ancient dragon knowledge combined with modern human mathematical notation. They saw images of the great battle where humans and dragons had fought together against the creatures from the deep, driving them back into the darkness. But what impressed the visitors most were the symbols of cooperation that appeared throughout the facility. Human and dragon names carved together on plaques honoring great discoveries. Joint research projects that would have been impossible for either species alone. Schools where human children learned from dragon teachers about vibration and harmony, while young dragons learned from human instructors about mathematics and engineering. After the tour, James guided the delegates to meet Velcara. The young dragon had grown into a magnificent creature, her scales shining with that bronze luster that had signaled her recovery all those years ago. She now led the dragon's scientific research division, working on projects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Scars marked her body from the great battle, each one a reminder of the sacrifice she had made to protect her people and her human friends. Velcara represents something important, James told the delegates. She was dying. She was poisoned and weak. But she was given a chance. A human gave her that chance, and in return she and her mother gave humanity knowledge that transformed our colony into something remarkable. That is what cooperation can achieve. Velcara released a plume of harmonic fire into the air, and the delegates gasped in wonder. The sound was unlike anything they had ever experienced, beautiful and complex, carrying within it layers of meaning and emotion. That evening James walked through the settlement with Kaeldar and Velcara. They visited the memorial garden where names had been carved into stone to honor those who had died protecting the Alliance during the Great Battle. Human names and dragon names stood side by side, equal in importance, united in sacrifice. "Do you remember," Kaeldar said through the communication system that James had learned to understand, "when you first approached me that night? You were afraid." "I was terrified," James admitted. "But your eyes told me that you were more afraid than I was. Your daughter's life was more important than my fear." "And now?" Velcara asked, her voice carrying harmonics that conveyed curiosity and affection. "Now," James said, "I know that fear is just the beginning of understanding. When we choose to move past fear, we find connection. When we choose connection, we find possibility." Over the following months, the impact of the Human-Dragon Alliance continued to spread. Other civilizations began approaching Kepler 442b not as a place to conquer or exploit, but as a place to learn. Species that had fought each other for millennia began to seek mediation and cooperation. The Zephyrians, who had warred with the Draconis for 3,000 years, established their first peaceful embassy on the planet. The Federation Council asked James to become an ambassador. He was offered positions of power and influence, but James declined most of them. Instead, he chose to continue his work as a doctor, training new physicians in the techniques that had saved Velcara's life. He wanted to show others that sometimes the most powerful thing one person could do was simply to help. One evening, as Kepler 442b's twin moons rose in the violet sky, James stood with Kaeldar on the highest tower of the settlement, looking out over the landscape that had been transformed by cooperation and understanding. "What do you see?" Kaeldar asked. "I see hope," James said. "I see what happens when we choose to see beyond differences. I see a future where species work together instead of fighting. I see humanity's true power, and it is not in weapons or technology. It is in our capacity to recognize that a mother's love transcends species. That compassion is stronger than fear. That one choice, made with courage and kindness, can change entire worlds." Velcara landed beside them, her massive wings folding carefully so as not to disturb the delicate instruments mounted on the tower. "The universe is watching," Velcara said. "They are asking how this happened. How did a human and a dragon become family?" James smiled and placed his hand on Kaeldar's neck, feeling the warmth of her scales beneath his palm. "The same way any family is formed," he said. "Through caring for each other. Through sacrifice. Through choosing again and again to trust and to love." As the three of them watched the moons rise higher, casting their strange light across the rust-colored desert, they understood that their story was more than just the tale of a human and a dragon. It was the beginning of something new for the entire galaxy. It was proof that even the most impossible bridges could be built, one act of kindness at a time.